In Module 3, we explored the diverse human activities which are carried out in our marine space. We've also discussed the need to manage these effectively in order to ensure that negative impacts are reduced and that marine ecosystems can thrive and continue to provide us with the services we rely on. The UN Environment Programme estimates the cumulative economic impact of poor ocean management practices globally is at least $200 billion a year. Significant effort is needed to improve management approaches and protect our natural capital. This includes strengthening policy at a global, regional and national level, including the Sustainable Development Goals and the ECROP, and the development of new tools such as marine spatial planning to help countries balance different uses and interests. Types of marine management include those shown here, ranging from fisheries to oil and gas, and marine protected areas to tourism. In this module, we look in more detail at the management of some of these individual sectors and activities. These are often managed through different regulatory frameworks and using different approaches, which is understandable as the human activities being controlled are very different. After all, you couldn't manage fisheries in the same way you manage oil and gas. We will explore some fundamentals about marine management, how this fits with marine spatial planning, and some examples of how this is happening on the ground in the Caribbean. It is important to understand the difference between planning and management. Planning looks forward, planning ahead for the future, based on policy which provides a guide and direction of travel for individual sectors based on the best interests of society. For example, where food security is important, policy might set out ambitions for developing aquaculture, such as the farming of fish or seaweed, for enhancing food supply for the local population. Or, to ensure energy security and reduce reliance on imported oil, renewable energy policy might set a goal for development of renewable energy. Planning, including marine spatial planning and other government guidance, then indicates where and how these might be developed, balancing these with other sectors and interests, including conservation. Management of individual marine activities, on the other hand, is often reactive, where decisions are made to manage activities which may be looking to meet government policy outcomes, exploit marine resources, or just to enjoy the beautiful marine environment for recreational purposes. Such management often sets out the boundaries and constraints within which economic or social activity can operate. This allows private sector businesses who are interested in the generation of income, employment and wealth to innovate and invest to develop projects which are technologically and economically feasible but are also acceptable from a marine management perspective.
I always remember the lesson of the tragedy of the commons, right? We have a common lake, for example. But let's look at it from another point. I have a lake. It belongs to me. That is my property. When I go to fish in my lake, I catch all the big fish. I leave all the small ones. That means that I always have a stock of fish in my lake. But if you have another lake, similar size and everything like that, that is common property, it is difficult to control everybody. So what would happen is that everybody goes and they want to catch a fish. So they will catch the big ones, they catch the small ones, they catch everybody. At the end of it, what happens is that the fishes in the lake die out, but it doesn't affect me alone, it affects everybody. So we have to look at it from when we're looking at managing resources, be it marine resources, be it terrestrial resources. When we're looking at managing, we have to look at it from a perspective that I'm not going to harm it, because if I do, it's not going to affect me alone, but it's going to affect all my peers, you know. And that is the approach I think that we have to take in looking at marine resources. And basically,
a traditional way to manage human activities is a command and control approach, where regulations set out the ways in which certain activities are managed to control their impacts on the marine environment and their interaction with other human activities. This approach is useful for activities which are easily controlled in terms of when and where they happen, such as oil and gas exploration. Licenses or permits are issued for activities which might impact the marine environment, such as drilling, which causes waste, noise from installation vessels or seismic operations, and the potential for oil spills. Regulations also control other aspects such as navigation and interaction with other activities such as fishing to ensure safety and reduce the risk of accidents. Other activities with fixed infrastructure are managed in this way, including aquaculture, such as the installation of fish cages, telecommunications and underwater cabling, and marine renewable energy like offshore wind farms or tidal or wave energy installations. It's important to consider all aspects of these projects which are regulated, including substations cabling for transmission of electricity in offshore wind or pipelines for oil, and other activities through the lifetime of the activity, including maintenance vessels. At the end of life of the project, decommissioning takes place to remove old infrastructure or make it safe, and these are also highly regulated activities. Regulatory approaches are useful for managing highly controllable activities where the impacts are well understood. They can be more straightforward to implement as the rules are specific and predictable, which provide certainty for businesses and marine users. But these approaches can also be problematic, especially where there's uncertainty around impacts or changes in the marine activities. For example, when new technologies are developed which were not around when the regulations were designed, or when environmental baselines change, for example through climate change. They can also be costly to implement, as any regulatory management needs surveillance and enforcement to ensure that marine users are complying with regulations, and in the marine environment this can be very expensive. As you might imagine, fishing activity is challenging to manage as it is mobile and diverse, with different types of boats, species and fishing effort. It's also difficult to understand the changes in fish populations, to understand if the management approach is effective and ensure that the fish stock is not being depleted. Some approaches to fisheries management are top-down, where the government sets a quota or limit to catch for specific types of fish. This quota limit is normally set at the maximum amount of fish that can be harvested without damaging the ecological viability of the stock or the maximum sustainable yield. This quota is regulated by monitoring the fish as it is landed in ports and harbours and by using tracking technology on vessels. Fisheries enforcement vessels also check whether boats at sea are catching the right species and are within their limits. However, it's challenging and expensive to police these activities, and the science is often limited in understanding whether stocks are in fact being managed sustainably. Other approaches to management are therefore being developed to promote compliance and which can more easily adapt to changing practices, activity and understanding of the health of the stocks. Fisheries co-management is being developed in the Caribbean and is a flexible process where government and fisherfolk share the responsibility and authority for management of their resources. This approach is promoted by the UN SDGs and the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, which highlight the importance of empowering fisherfolk and involving them in the management of their resources. In 2013, the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism coordinated an innovative fisheries project across 6 OECS member states: Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St Kitts and Nevis, St Lucia and St Vincent and the Grenadines, to test co-management approaches. It promoted the joint development and management between local fisherfolk and fisheries managers of fish aggregating devices, or FADs, for harvesting tuna and other pelagic species. In Dominica, where most of the FADs were deployed, fisheries production increased significantly in a well-managed way. Today, co-management is recognised as an effective approach for the sustainable management of small-scale fisheries and is used in many Caribbean island states. Carifico, in collaboration with government agencies, fishers and local partners, aims to develop co-management approaches unique to each country. Bottom-up, community-led management is another important approach to the management of multiple marine activities, as it empowers local people and stakeholders to understand their activities' impacts and build a collective understanding of how resources should be managed. This type of approach is increasingly important in addressing the SDGs.
So essentially we work with the communities, different stakeholders and the communities, to ensure that their livelihoods continue to exist. We work with the dive association, fishers, pretty much any resource user, to ensure that their activities continue to exist within the marine environment without having too much of a negative impact on the resources that they depend on.
An example of bottom-up management is the Sufi Air marine management area in St Lucia, where the interactions between tourists, local fishermen, water taxis, the dive industry, yachters, recreational users and the MPA are managed carefully. The MMA and the rules and regulations within it were developed through participation and negotiation between different marine users, with a small committee to lead the discussions and support in resolving conflicts and promoting solutions. The benefits of this approach are that users are more likely to comply with rules which they have been engaged in developing and which protect their interests alongside others. It also means that local knowledge, such as who fishes where, can be incorporated into the process.
The SMMA, we manage the whole West Coast, which is about 22 kilometers of sea space. And that ranges from Sugar Beach in the south to Marigot up in the north. The SMMA is about 25 years in existence, and it started with the whole conflict between fishers, yachtsmen, and the boaters. And as a result, the Sufi Air Marine Management Association was formed to manage this whole area. And what actually happened, we created different zones. So 5 zones were created where you had fishing priority areas, marine reserve, dive areas, dive and snorkel, and yachting areas, and the multiple use areas. So that was created to help manage the whole area. Yes.
In Dominica, the Scots Head Local Area Management Association, or LAMA, is a voluntary organisation made up of local stakeholders including fishermen, village councillors and representatives of the tourism industry. They're responsible for the management of the marine reserve, and their role is to reduce user conflicts, to preserve the traditional fishing practices, and to ensure conservation of the resource for all visitors and stakeholders. Financing and ensuring the capacity of bottom-up management is often a challenge. In the case of the Lama in Dominica, an innovative approach is to charge a small fee for use of the reserve, for example for diving tourism. The user fee goes straight back into maintaining the marine reserve and its resources. Marine protected area management is different again, in that it is focused on the protection of a habitat or species primarily, rather than only the control of a specific activity. Notwithstanding this, it is very difficult to directly manage the marine environment. Rather, we have to manage the human activities that impact it, as already discussed. As such, MPA management may rely on many other management or regulatory regimes to control human activity as the primary means of reducing pressure on a sensitive habitat or species. This can then allow more proactive management approaches, such as seagrass or coral restoration, to take place. Experience has taught us that when considering MPA management, it is important to highlight the community benefits that come from putting restrictions on activities, some of which may be cultural or social activities that have been done in the same way for generations. MPA management therefore focuses on the creation of conservation objectives for the habitat or species that is being protected, and then using a toolbox of regulatory and non-regulatory approaches to manage activities that pose the most risk to the MPA.
We've come up with a number of strategies to ensure that, for example, fishing is not allowed in our marine protected areas. These areas would have historically been fishing grounds. So what we've done is work with those fishers that would have been displaced to come up with supplemental and alternative livelihoods so that they would continue to generate a livelihood from those same areas while having those areas being enhanced or restored, and they can continue to fish in areas outside of those. But we don't want to have a situation where we have restoration of the habitats and the fisher livelihoods and the society that depend on those resources is lost. So it's essentially a really delicate balancing act that we're trying to achieve, but we've been making positive strides.
In summary, marine management is not a one-size-fits-all process, and it sits below policy and planning, which should guide management decision-making. The decision-making and management processes are different for different sectors and uses. Regulatory approaches are used for managing the impacts of activities which are easily controlled, including the spatially fixed infrastructure of oil and gas, renewable energy, or aquaculture. New approaches are developing, including co-management, which involves stakeholders and local citizens to empower them in the management of their marine space. In this module, we've looked at how human activity can be managed effectively in order to ensure that negative impacts are reduced and that ecosystems can thrive. In Module 10, we will explore blue careers across the private and public sectors and civil society to support the engagement of young people in the diverse activities involved in the blue economy.